Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Chairman Wilson is a co-sponsor of our legislation. We work together in support of efforts to try to designate agents that are clearly terrorist groups or genociders. And we had a bill last year to declare Russia a perpetrator of genocide, but for some reason, the State Department didn't work with us on that, and apparently my chairman of the Democratic chairman didn't work with us either. It was rather difficult because just like Mr. Blumenthal recognized, Senator Blumenthal, how much that was appreciated in Ukraine, they would have appreciated the designation. Zelensky particularly asked us when he came to the Congress to designate them as a genocider. And sometimes the State Department needs a kick in the rear, a strong kick in the rear, and that's what this bill might do. That's what we're trying to do. Mr. Wright, you might have discussed this. I was in Transportation Committee. Do you have any ideas, or anybody else have any ideas, why the State Department is being so reticent? I mean, I know about the theory of Africa countries and blah, 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 and maybe a precursor to naming Russia a terrorist group. And, are they afraid of shadows, or what's their reasons for being timid?
Well, on the question of a genocide, generally speaking, under the Genocide Convention, there's an obligation once an event or conflict or a series of events is categorized as a genocide, it requires states to undertake affirmative obligations to stop and prevent the genocide. And so I know historically the U.S. government has been traditionally reluctant to call a spade when in fact it's a spade, based on that international obligation.
But that obligation is when the government,
Correct.
Administration does it.
That's
if
right.
Congress does it, it doesn't put those obligations on them.
That's right. That's right. And what I'm speaking to is just really the obligation under the Genocide Convention, more particularly. That's my understanding as to the general reluctance, not just within the United States, but within the international community. I think we all can observe what's happening and when it's happening. But when the issues of state responsibilities come into play, I think that's probably the resistance from the State Department. And I haven't studied this issue in particular. I can only speak to my understanding generally of those obligations. But that would be my assessment, sir. But perhaps my colleagues have some additional thoughts.
Please, and I want to ask you another question, Mr. Blazakis, and this is to educate me. I mean, I know a little bit about Ian Fleming, but I don't know a whole lot about international bad guys like he did. And he probably envisioned Prigozhin. It was one of the guys. How many other organizations like this have there been, or are there any that are just private groups that are just out there to do bad things in mass quantities?
So I'd love to also respond to your last
Sure.
question, since I used to be one of those people you probably kicked in the butt when I worked at the State Department as the head of the office that made the FTO designations. And I will say congressional pressure is actually really helpful to get things moving within the executive branch. And I was there where there was a lot of controversy about the possible designation of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization and the Haqqani Network. And congressional bills were really important in terms of gathering momentum within the executive branch. So I think the HARM Act is particularly important. The reasons why the State Department may not have designated the group, it could be a range of reasons. The one reason could be very simply, the process to designate foreign terrorist organizations can take up to a year gathering the evidence, compiling it, and coordinating it within the interagency to ensure that other national security agencies don't have equities that could be impaired with respect to the designation. The other point I would make is the State Department hasn't added a foreign terrorist organization to the list since 2021. And I think there could be a few reasons for that. One reason is I know they don't have the coordinator right now for counterterrorism. And fighting within the State Department on challenging issues like this could be where maybe, say, the European Affairs Bureau could be opposed to the designation, requires a political appointee that has some gumption that can take on those interagency fights. So I think that might be another point that's important in the context of this conversation. The other point I would make is there's a perception often in the State Department that designations or sanctions more generally can tie the hands of diplomats and force them into boxes they don't want to be in. I think this is a perception that probably exists within the State Department, thinking that if you were to add Wagner to the list, somehow it's going to result in some kind of state sponsor of terrorism designation for Russia, which, as I mentioned earlier, would not be the case. So in the context of why there's delay, I think this is perhaps why we're seeing some delay from the State Department.
And how about these other groups? Are there other groups?
Yes.
No, in the world, have there been other groups like the Wagner Group that have been so outrageous and so large and so effective?
Yeah, so Wagner is, in one sense, unique because it is a significantly large organization with tens of thousands of individuals that have the full backing of a country that has significant power, Russia in this context. But we have seen the State Department designate paramilitary or PMC-like groups in the past, and a really good example of that would be the AUC in Colombia. The AUC paramilitary force created ostensibly by the Colombian government to go after leftists within Colombia, to include the FARC. Went off the rails, carried out heinous acts against civilians at the same time. And they were designated as a foreign terrorist organization. So I think there is an analog where designating the PMC would not set a precedent for the State Department because you have had organizations like it sanctioned before. And then, of course, Hezbollah is a foreign terrorist organization. And it has very similar capabilities as the Wagner Group in terms of the scope of personnel and the backing it gets from states, particularly a state like Iran.
If I can just have one more question. Thank you for assuming that the sanctions are supposed to be effective and we put more sanctions on them and all these kind of things. If the Wagner Group is effective in fighting this war, is Putin going to do anything to stop the Wagner Group? And can he just take them and make them instead appoint Prigozhin a deputy and his group becomes part of the Russian military and blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I think the most likely scenario is Prigozhin gets a little too big for his britches and stops himself and results to his ultimate demise, probably at the hands of Putin or others within Putin's inner circle. I do think Prigozhin has made an effort to not only project power in places like Ukraine and places like the Central African Republic, but also is trying to make inroads internally within Russia. You know, Prigozhin created a tech center in St. Petersburg because of the brain drain from Moscow in terms of skills that the country's losing because people just don't want to get up and fight for Putin. And in that sense, I think Prigozhin's trying to gain a bigger foothold within Russia to have a domestic presence. And I think that sex sector he's created actually is one way to do that. So I do see him trying to become perhaps more involved in domestic politics as well.
I yield back the remainder of my time.
Here, here.